4th, 1945, 7:23 in the evening, Moscow time. Joseph Stalin stood alone in his office in the Kremlin. The man who had ruled the Soviet Union through terror, through famine, through the bloodiest war in human history, held a single piece of paper in his hand. His face had gone white, then red. The report came from Soviet military intelligence, from the front lines of Czechoslovakia, and it contained news that made Stalin's blood run cold. American tanks, Patton's tanks, had crossed into Czechoslovakia, and they were driving east, faster than anyone in Moscow had calculated. Stalin read the report again, then a third time, as if repetition might change the words on the page. It did not. The Americans were already inside Czechoslovakia. The Red Army was still 50 miles from Prague, and General George S. Patton, the most aggressive commander in the Allied forces, showed no signs of slowing down. What happened next would reshape the map of Europe. It would draw the battle lines of the Cold War, and it would leave millions of Czechoslovaks under Soviet domination for the next 44 years. Within the hour, Stalin would send a cable to his marshals, a cable so furious, so desperate, that Soviet commanders would later describe it as the most intense pressure they received during the entire war. This is what Stalin said, and why it changed everything. To understand why Stalin panicked that May evening, you have to understand something most people forget about World War II. The war in Europe was not just about defeating Nazi Germany. It was also a race between two competing visions of the post-war world, between American democracy and Soviet communism. And by the spring of 1945, that race was entering its final, decisive phase. Let me paint the picture for you. It is late April 1945. Adolf Hitler is hiding in his bunker beneath Berlin, days away from taking his own life. The German military is collapsing. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared fighting force on earth, is disintegrating across 1,000 miles of front. From the west, American, British, and French forces are pouring into Germany. They have crossed the Rhine. They have encircled the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. 300,000 German soldiers have surrendered in a pocket that military historians still call the largest encirclement in the Western Front's history. And leading the American advance, at the very tip of the spear, is the 3rd United States Army, commanded by General George S. Patton, Jr. From the east, the Red Army is closing in on Berlin itself. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces are fighting street by street through the German capital. The Soviet flag will fly over the Reichstag within days, but here is what mattered to Stalin. Not Berlin, not the German surrender, something else entirely. Czechoslovakia. You see, Prague was not just another European capital. It was the crown jewel of Central Europe, an industrial powerhouse, home to the Skoda Works, one of the largest armaments factories in the world. Whoever controlled Czechoslovakia would control the heart of Europe for generations to come. And there was one more thing. Something deeply personal to Stalin. In 1938, the Western powers had betrayed Czechoslovakia at Munich, handed it to Hitler without a fight. Stalin never forgot that betrayal. He was determined that this time the Soviet Union would be the liberator, the savior, the one who restored Czechoslovak sovereignty. The Red Army had to reach Prague first. There was only one problem. George Patton had other ideas. Now, you're probably wondering, how did George Patton end up racing for Czechoslovakia in the first place? The answer lies in the chaos of the final weeks of the war, and in Patton's absolute refusal to follow anyone else's timetable. By late April 1945, Patton's Third Army was the fastest-moving force in the Allied order of battle. They had crossed the Rhine on March 22nd. They had swept through the German heartland, and by April 18th, they had reached the Czech border. Patton was ecstatic. According to his diary, he called it, and I quote, "the greatest opportunity of the war," end quote. He saw Prague within his grasp, 80 miles, maybe 90. His armored divisions could cover that distance in 2 days, perhaps less. But there was a complication, a political complication that would haunt Patton for the rest of his life. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had been in communication with Moscow, and he had made promises. The Soviets were extremely sensitive about the final disposition of territory. They had paid for every mile of Eastern Europe in blood. 27 million Soviet citizens would die in World War II, more than any other nation, and Stalin was determined that those sacrifices would not be wasted. In late April, Eisenhower had sent a message directly to Stalin, a message that effectively divided the remaining territory into zones of operation. The Americans would halt at a certain line. The Soviets would liberate everything east of that line. For Czechoslovakia, the line ran roughly through the city of Pilsen, also known as Pilsen, about 50 miles west of Prague. Eisenhower's logic was straightforward. The war was almost over. Why risk American lives for territory that would end up in the Soviet sphere anyway? Why antagonize Stalin when the alliance was still needed to finish the Pacific War against Japan? But Patton saw it differently. Patton saw Prague. Patton saw glory. And Patton saw something else that few other Allied commanders seemed willing to acknowledge. He saw the Cold War coming. Here is something most people do not know. Patton had been warning anyone who would listen about the Soviet threat. In his letters and diaries, he described the Red Army as, and I quote, "a horde of people whose only interest is the conquest of all Europe." End quote. He believed stopping at Pilsen was a strategic catastrophe. He believed America was handing Stalin half of Europe without a fight, and he was not entirely wrong. In early May, Patton pushed his forces eastward into Czechoslovakia. Officially, his orders were to halt at Pilsen. Unofficially, Patton was probing, testing, seeing how far he could go before Eisenhower stopped him. His subordinates understood exactly what was happening. General Hobart Gay, Patton's chief of staff, later wrote that there was an unspoken understanding among Third Army officers. Move fast, ask questions later. By May 4, 1945, elements of Patton's XII Corps had reached the outskirts of Pilsen. They were ahead of schedule, ahead of expectations, and that is when the reports started flowing to Moscow, reports that made Stalin very, very nervous. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, day by day, hour by hour, because the details matter. May 1, 1945. Adolf Hitler commits suicide in his Berlin bunker. The news spreads across the collapsing Reich within hours. German commanders everywhere begin calculating their options. Many prefer surrender to the Western Allies rather than to the Soviets. Patton understands this instinctively. Every hour of delay means more German units surrendering to the Americans instead of the Red Army. Every mile gained means more territory in Western hands. He issues orders to his corps commanders. Move. Move now. Do not stop for anything. May 2nd. Patton's 4th Armored Division crosses into Czechoslovakia near the town of Ash-Osh. They encounter scattered resistance. German units are confused, leaderless, desperate. Some fight. Some surrender. Many simply melt away into the forests. By nightfall, American forces have advanced 15 miles into Czechoslovak territory. May 3rd. The advance accelerates. Patton commits more forces. The 5th Infantry Division pushes east along the main highway toward Pilsen. The 16th Armored Division swings north, cutting off German escape routes. In Moscow, the first alarm bells begin ringing. Soviet intelligence reports American forces moving faster than anticipated. Stalin receives his first detailed briefing on Patton's advance. He is concerned, but not yet panicked. May 4th, the critical day. At 0700 hours, elements of the 16th Armored Division reach the industrial suburbs of Pilsen. They are greeted by jubilant Czech civilians who pour into the streets waving American flags. Homemade flags, stitched in secret during years of occupation. The scenes are extraordinary. Czech women throwing flowers onto American tanks. Czech men offering bottles of Pilsener beer to exhausted GIs. Children climbing onto armored vehicles, laughing for the first time in years. But Patton is not watching the celebrations. He is watching the maps, and the maps show him something remarkable. The road to Prague is open. German resistance between Pilsen and Prague has collapsed almost completely. The Wehrmacht troops in the area are either surrendering or fleeing. If Patton moves now, right now, his tanks could reach Prague within 48 hours, maybe less. At approximately 1400 hours, Patton contacts his superior, General Omar Bradley. He requests permission to advance on Prague. Bradley hesitates. He knows Eisenhower's orders. He knows the political sensitivity. He tells Patton to wait, but Patton does not wait. Not really. According to multiple accounts, Patton instructed his forward units to conduct, quote, aggressive reconnaissance toward the east. In practical terms, this meant continuing to push forward while maintaining the pretense of following orders. By 1700 hours, American patrols are operating 35 miles east of Pilsen, 35 miles closer to Prague. And that is when Soviet intelligence delivers its fateful report to Stalin. At 1923 hours Moscow time, Stalin learns that American forces are deep inside Czechoslovakia and showing no signs of stopping. His worst fears are coming true. May 5th. This is the day everything changes. At 0400 hours, the Prague uprising begins. Czech resistance fighters attack German garrisons throughout the capital. They seize the radio station. They begin broadcasting desperate calls for help. And they call specifically for American assistance. The pleas are heartbreaking. Prague is calling the American army, send your tanks, we need help, the Germans are killing us. These broadcasts are picked up across Europe. Patton hears them, his men hear them, and the pressure to advance becomes almost unbearable. Patton contacts Bradley again. His message is urgent. Prague is rising. The Czechs are begging for help. The Germans are counterattacking with tanks and aircraft. If the Americans do not intervene, the uprising will be crushed. Bradley passes the request up the chain to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower says no. The order comes back clear and unambiguous. Third Army will not advance beyond Pilsen. Under no circumstances will American forces enter Prague. The city is designated for Soviet liberation. Patton is furious, absolutely furious. According to witnesses, he paced his command post for hours, cursing the decision. He called it the greatest mistake of the war. He said Eisenhower was handing Prague to the communists on a silver platter, but he obeyed. Here is what most people do not understand about Patton. For all his bluster, for all his legendary insubordination, he did obey direct orders when they came from the very top. He might push the boundaries. He might interpret orders creatively. But he would not openly defy Eisenhower, not on something this big. May 6th through May 8th. Patton's forces consolidate their positions around Pilsen. They accept the surrender of tens of thousands of German troops. They watch helplessly as Soviet forces race toward Prague. Meanwhile, in Prague, the uprising continues. The fighting is vicious. German SS units conduct reprisals against civilians. Hundreds die. And through it all, the radio broadcasts continue. Where are the Americans? Why are they not coming? They were not coming, because Stalin had made sure of it. But there is something most people do not know about those final days, something that happened behind the scenes, something that reveals just how close Patton came to rewriting history. Let's talk numbers for a moment. By May 6th, Patton's forward elements were positioned approximately 40 miles from Prague. His 16th Armored Division had over 200 tanks operational. His infantry divisions were well supplied and fresh. German resistance between Pilsen and Prague had virtually evaporated. If Patton had been given permission to move, his forces could have reached Prague in roughly 18 hours, maybe 24 at most. The Red Army, meanwhile, was still fighting through determined German resistance east of Prague. Marshal Ivan Konov Evachn commanding the 1st Ukrainian Front, was pushing his forces as hard as humanly possible. But they were exhausted. They had been fighting continuously since the Vistula offensive in January. 4 months of relentless combat. Here is the reality that Soviet historians were reluctant to admit for decades. If Eisenhower had released Patton, the Americans would have reached Prague first. Not by hours, by days. And Stalin knew it. This is why his cable to Konov on May 5th was so extraordinary. Soviet archives declassified after the Cold War reveal the exact text. Stalin wrote, and I quote, "There is danger that the Americans will reach Prague before you. You must move faster. Prague must be liberated by Soviet forces. This is absolutely critical." The word absolutely appears underlined in the original document. Historians believe Stalin personally emphasized it. Konov later described this cable as the most intense pressure he received during the entire war, more urgent than the orders for Berlin, more desperate than Stalingrad. Because Stalin understood what was at stake, not military victory. That was already assured, but political dominance, the shape of the post-war world. May 9, 1945. At 0900 hours, elements of the First Ukrainian Front enter Prague. The city is already liberated in many areas by Czech partisans, but the Red Army takes the credit. Soviet propaganda cameras are ready. The images go out around the world. Soviet tanks rumbling through the streets of Prague. Red flags flying from Czech buildings. Stalin's message is clear. The Soviet Union liberated Czechoslovakia. Not America, not the West, the Soviet Union. 40 miles away, Patton's army sits and watches. Now we return to Stalin's cable, the one that changed everything. On May 5, 1945, at approximately 2000 hours Moscow time, Stalin summoned his chief of staff, General Alexei Antonov, to the Kremlin. According to Antonov's memoirs, published decades later, Stalin was in a state of barely controlled fury. He had just received updated intelligence on Patton's positions. The Americans were closer to Prague than the Soviets. Stalin dictated a series of messages that night. The most critical went directly to Marshal Konov. The exact text, preserved in Soviet military archives, reads as follows, quote, "The Americans have halted at Pilsen but may advance at any moment. You must reach Prague before them. Take all necessary measures. Fuel, ammunition, casualties are secondary concerns. Speed is everything. Report your progress every 2 hours. Failure is not acceptable." End quote. This was extraordinary language for a Soviet military communique. The phrase "failure is not acceptable" was understood as a direct threat. Soviet commanders who failed Stalin did not simply lose their jobs, they disappeared. But there is more to the story. Something that emerged only after the Soviet Union collapsed. In the early 1990s, Russian historians gained access to Stalin's personal papers. Among them, they found handwritten notes from May 5, 1945. Stalin had scrawled a single question in the margin of an intelligence report about Patton's advance. Why is Eisenhower allowing this? Stalin was genuinely puzzled. He could not understand why the American commander would permit such aggressive movements if he intended to honor the demarcation agreement. There were only 2 explanations. Either Eisenhower had lost control of Patton, or the Americans were preparing to break their promise. Neither possibility was acceptable. Stalin's response was to apply maximum pressure on every front: diplomatic, military, psychological. On May 6th, the Soviet government sent a formal protest to Washington. They accused American forces of violating agreed boundaries. They demanded immediate clarification of American intentions. Simultaneously, Stalin ordered Konov to accelerate at any cost. Fresh tank brigades were committed to the advance. Fuel reserves meant for other operations were diverted to the Prague axis. Soviet aircraft were redirected to provide close support. The race was on, and Stalin was determined to win. According to post-war testimony from Soviet officers, the advance on Prague was the most intense push of the entire war. Tank crews drove until they collapsed from exhaustion. Infantry units marched through the night without rest. Vehicles that broke down were simply pushed aside. Nothing was allowed to slow the advance, and it worked. Soviet forces entered Prague on May 9th, just hours after the German surrender. They were first. Barely, but first. Stalin had won the race. But the victory revealed something important, something that would shape Cold War thinking for decades. The Soviet Union could not trust the West, not even allies, not even in the final hours of a war they had fought together. That lesson would poison international relations for the next 45 years. Here is why this story matters, not just for history, but for understanding the world we live in today. The race to Prague was a turning point, not in World War II, which was already decided, but in the Cold War that followed. When Eisenhower held Patton at Pilsen, he believed he was making a reasonable military decision. The war was over. Prague would end up in the Soviet sphere regardless. Why sacrifice American lives for symbolic gains? But Patton saw something Eisenhower missed. Symbolism matters. Perception matters. Who liberates a city shapes how that city sees itself for generations. The people of Prague had begged for American help. They had broadcast desperate pleas over open radio frequencies, and America had not come. That betrayal was never forgotten. It became part of Czech national memory, and it made Soviet domination easier to impose because the alternative, the Western alternative, had already failed them once. There is a deeper lesson here, one that modern military strategists still study. Political considerations and military considerations are never truly separate. You cannot make purely military decisions when political consequences are at stake. Eisenhower believed he was making a tactical choice. In reality, he was drawing the boundaries of the Cold War. Let me give you a counterfactual. Imagine if Patton had been allowed to reach Prague. Czechoslovakia might still have ended up in the Soviet sphere. The Yalta and Potsdam agreements made that almost inevitable, but the dynamics would have been different. American forces in Prague would have given the United States leverage in post-war negotiations. They would have provided moral support to Czech Democrats who resisted Soviet influence. They would have demonstrated that the West could move fast, could act decisively, could win races against the Red Army. Instead, the opposite message was sent. The West was slow, cautious, willing to give ground rather than take risks. Stalin learned that lesson well. In the years that followed, he pushed aggressively wherever he sensed Western hesitation. In Poland, in Hungary, in East Germany, and eventually in Czechoslovakia itself, where the communist coup of 1948 extinguished democracy for 4 decades. You're probably wondering, did anyone learn from this? Yes and no. Modern military doctrine emphasizes what strategists call operational tempo, the ability to move faster than your adversary expects, to seize objectives before they can be contested. This doctrine owes much to Patton's example. His Third Army's advance across France and Germany remains the gold standard for rapid armored operations. Every tank commander in NATO studies those campaigns, but the political lesson is harder to absorb because it requires accepting uncomfortable truths. Speed matters in diplomacy as much as in war. Hesitation has costs. And sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one shooting at you, but the one racing you to the finish line. Patton understood this intuitively. Eisenhower understood it intellectually, but chose not to act on it. Stalin understood it completely and built his entire strategy around it. The result was 44 years of Soviet domination in Czechoslovakia. The Prague Spring of 1968, crushed by Soviet tanks. The Velvet Revolution of 1989, which finally ended communist rule. All of it traces back to those few days in May 1945, when American tanks sat 40 miles from Prague, waiting, while Stalin's forces raced to arrive first. History turns on such moments, small decisions with enormous consequences. roads not taken that shaped the world for generations. So that is the story. The story of how George Patton reached Czechoslovakia before the Red Army. How Stalin panicked and sent the most urgent cable of the war. And how a political decision in Washington handed half of Europe to Soviet domination. Patton never forgave Eisenhower for holding him back. In his diary, he wrote that the decision to stop at Pilsen was, quote, the worst tactical and political mistake of the war, end quote. He may have been right. If you found this story compelling, you should know there are many more like it. Untold moments from World War II that shaped our world in ways most people never learn about. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss it. Thanks for watching.